Hey y'all, welcome to the Texas Blockcast, a podcast where we cover all things digital assets policy. I'm here with our guest today, Monica Gaudioso, who is the co-chair of the digital assets practice at Carrington Coleman. We're going to talk about DAOs, we're going to talk about Fit 21, we're going to just dive into the policy happenings of the last 2 weeks, which has been crazy.
So crazy.
Thanks for being here, Monica.
Yeah, I'm super excited to be here. Thank you so much. We love the Texas Blockchain Council, and super excited to dive into what's been happening in the world of DAOs.
I know. So we've got Wyoming made some headlines a few months ago with their passage of a DAO bill called a DUNA. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit more about what DUNA stands for and kind of the basis for all of this?
Yeah, so the Wyoming bill, which is going to go officially into effect July 1 of this year, is a version of what's called an UNA, which is a unincorporated nonprofit association, and the DUNA is just the decentralized unincorporated nonprofit association. And basically the reason the UNA has been sort of cited as a good corporate wrapper for DAOs specifically, for a couple of different reasons. It provides the liability protection for its members. There was a case in California a few years ago where it was Ooki DAO, OOKI. There were some securities violations and commodities. The Commodities and Futures Trading Commission came after them, and the court in that case decided that the individual members of the DAO who had no real involvement in the actual operations or the underlying fraud were individually liable for the operations of Ooki DAO. So I think that somewhat was a wake-up call to the DAO industry in general, that they needed to do something to protect their members, because frankly, who's going to be the member of a DAO if you are going to be on the hook for some kind of liability that you have no control over? And so as a result of that, there's been a lot of discussion about what they call corporate wrappers, and one of the ones that has been sort of singled out is the UNA. UNAs aren't everywhere in all states, but they are in Texas, and they had one in Wyoming. And so Wyoming, some of their subcommittees in their legislative body decided to do basically a sub-chapter of the UNA for decentralized autonomous organizations. And so that is the bill that we have. It's very, very similar to what is the standard UNA, which is a uniform statute, with a few key differences. There's some new definitions, which, as everybody who's been paying attention at all to the regulatory scheme knows, that really the definitions are kind of where the rubber meets the road. So there's been some key definitional changes, as well as just giving some meat to the practice of governing DAOs. And so Wyoming doing it gives kind of everybody a playbook now. Wyoming has historically been on the forefront. I actually learned this getting ready for today, that they were the first ones to adopt the limited liability company, which everybody sort of knows and loves for traditional business forms. And so Wyoming really has a historical practice of coming out on these sort of new entity structures. And that's sort of what we've seen here, which is great. It gives everybody else a playbook. It gives the states something to see, something to wrap their heads around. I particularly I read a statement by one of the House members that was part of that process, who said, we and the legislator in Wyoming, we want to be iterative. We treat this not as a static thing. So, they're saying, we've got at least 40 amendments that we want to make in the next session. So, that's great to see. It's that kind of innovation and that kind of dedication to innovation. And I think that's what makes it's good to see it being done in a place that's dedicated to that, as opposed to coming out of maybe a more restrictive jurisdiction or something that's going to come out not in the way that the industry might like to see it.
Yeah, I agree. Now, we attempted to establish a DUNA statute in Texas last session, made it through the House, got held up in the Senate, mostly for lack of time. The clock just ran out on it. And there are conversations going on right now about reviving that effort in the next Texas session, the 89th session that starts January of 2025.
Yep.
Lots of positive changes, lots of great feedback from the business law community in Texas. And I think before we go into that, perhaps you can elucidate some of the sticking points that really create difficulties and challenges for people that aren't familiar with decentralization and sort of the need for that statutory entity formation option. What are some of the biggest objections and sticking points that you've encountered as to why DAOs need an appropriate structure?
So I think there's a couple of different ones. One is, okay, fine, say we buy into DAOs as they are, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but why can't you use an LLC? And I think an LLC, that was sort of my initial reaction, I'll admit, when I started getting into this space. I have a background in litigation, but I do a lot of corporate governance litigation. And so I'm very familiar with LLCs. They're very flexible. They have a lot of good qualities, but they don't perfectly mesh with what DAOs are trying to do. I am not a tax lawyer. I will never purport to be a tax lawyer. There are some tax issues with the way that LLCs are taxed. That actually, frankly, tax is, next to securities, one of the biggest hurdles I think that the industry faces is tax treatment. And I mean, frankly, at this point, we're putting our fingers in the air trying to figure out, guess basically what we should do. And so that's a big issue. But in addition, LLCs generate profit. And, as we know from being alive and being in the industry, is that the SEC is taking a very hard look at projects that are generating profits and distributing them to members, and they're taking a very hard look at protocols that are, potentially violating securities laws. So wrapping yourself in an LLC is going to make that, the visibility of that, a lot higher. And you may not need to do that. There are, if you want to undertake as a project a profit-making venture, there's going to be a lot of conversations to have about your risk tolerance on that. But there are a lot of groups that are running protocols that have social functions, that have civic functions, all those sorts of traditional, non-profity aspects that don't need that wrapper and don't need that scrutiny. And then ultimately, the other sort of big elephant in the room when you talk about the LLCs is because they register with the state, they are then subject to very onerous reporting requirements under what's called the Corporate Transparency Act, which was passed a few years ago but only went into effect this year. And I think that is that comes not only with onerous reporting requirements, which frankly undermine some of the autonomous nature of DAOs that people, I think like and gravitate to in the industry. But also, if you don't do it, there are significant penalties to not doing it, and it's difficult. And so, for some of these projects that are smaller or are very micro, micro focused, it's just not a viable entity structure for a lot of reasons. And that, I think, is why the UNA in particular has been singled out as a flexible entity structure that does not have the same reporting requirements because they don't register with the Secretary of State, and also sort of fits what I perceive to be a lot of the DAOs that are functioning in the world right now, the very civic and social good purposes that they want to achieve. Again, if you want to go out and do a project that does some sort of tokenization that makes money, there's a whole other sector of the law, of securities law, that you're going to have to sort of contend with, or at least try to find your way through the morass. I mean, we all know that is just a minefield at this point. We talked about FIT 21, and we will talk about FIT 21, which is sort of the path forward. But we don't perceive that there's going to be any movement on that this year. I think that's going to have to get taken up after the election. So, sure, there's a path, there's a way, or you could at least try to make your way on that front. But for other projects that are more interested in the social aspects or the social good aspects, the UNA is a much more flexible and also a much less onerous structure to adopt. Frankly, it's really easy. You kind of just get, currently the UNA is like 3 or more people decide they want to be an UNA. And have a nonprofit purpose, which in Texas is very broadly defined. So it's pretty simple, and that makes it, I think, the most appropriate. But given that blockchain, again, is, I think, definitions is really becoming where the rubber hits the road, and I think that's some criticisms that I've heard of Fit 21 in particular, is it's still leading a lot up to additional definitions and all that, and I understand the reasons for that, but I think adding definitions and tailoring the UNA structure to DAOs and making it kind of a subset, frankly, gives a lot of clarity and gives potential participants clarity, gives lawmakers clarity. Clarity, I think, is the most important goal, should be the most important goal for the industry at this point, barring pretty much little other than not committing fraud. Right. I think clarity will benefit everybody in that sense.
Yeah, and we reverse the trend of pushing innovators to Cayman foundations or Swiss foundations. Yeah,
and I mean, look, I'll admit, we've talked to a lot of Canadian, Bahamian lawyers about that process and what that looks like. I mean, setting aside that it's very complicated, it's extremely expensive. I mean, we've heard some quotes that are, 50 to 100 grand to get them set up. It requires a lot of, they have directorship requirements that you have to pay those people. There's a lot of, I would consider that process to be rather onerous. Again, if you are operating, if you want to open an exchange, you want to do something like that, those structures may be more appropriate. And all structures should really be looked at in terms of what the project is. But I think for DAOs, which are really designed for governance, and that's really ultimately, I think, the fundamental aspect here is DAOs by themselves are sort of neutral. They're not, they're governance structures. They're not profit-making centers. They're not charities. They're not 501c3 corporations. They're governance structures. It's very similar to a board of directors and shareholders, but like taking that, it's almost like taking that piece of a corporate structure out of the underlying, because really you are separate from that. And so the foundations, I think, that's a lot more complex, and I wonder aloud if the trend towards foundations, which became very popular, don't make lawmakers and law enforcement regulatory bodies just nervous by it in of themselves. If you're going offshore, are you just trying to hide things? And look, we can, everybody's talked about FTX, everybody's talked about Terra Luna. We all know that the hangover for these frauds can be really long. I will say that I find it fascinating that the one for FTX, I think the curve is getting a lot shorter. We're 18 months out, and I think we're seeing so much more progress in a positive way than I would have ever expected. I would have expected that hangover to be, much longer. Yeah. So that's good. I think that's positive, but there's always the question mark that isn't crypto just isn't it just a function of money launderers and fraudsters, and is it good to have an organization that doesn't register with the Secretary of State? Who do we hold responsible? Yeah. And ultimately, again, as with all things, particularly with new technology, it's education. Yeah. It's what are UNAs for? What do people use UNAs for? And then we're really just adding a technological spin on the UNA that's not really that revolutionary. And I think that's the educational piece.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the argument that who do we hold liable, if somebody within a DAO has, they use their human agency to commit some sort of crime, and maybe that crime is associated with the DAO in some way, there's nothing that prevents law enforcement from bringing charges against that individual. The DAO doesn't make them anonymous in real life.
Right. Right. It doesn't put a gloss over their the pixelated face. Yeah. So they still live in the world. Yeah. And ultimately that's the goal of corporate wrappers, is to get DAOs to be able to function in the world. Yeah. Pay taxes, don't shoot the messenger. Get EINs. open bank accounts, like all of these like very normal things that these entities need to do in order to do the social good that they want to do the civic good they want to do. But yeah, just because if you had an administrator or just somebody in the DAO who stole a bunch of money from the treasury, committed some kind of fraud on a potential investor, like there's nothing preventing, people like me, civil litigators, from going after them, people the DA, the U.S. Attorney's Office from going after them, regulators, things like that. I mean, the punitive aspects of the law will still apply. So yeah, it's not the UNA. I mean, if that was what an UNA did, everybody would be an UNA. Everybody, every cartel, every crime syndicate would be using UNAs as a way to get around the law. Like that's just not not how it works. And so I think that, again, I think UNAs are maybe, archaic's the wrong word, but not a very well known entity. And so to make a new UNA, you kind of have to start at the baseline of like, what is an UNA before you make a DUNA. And you explain a DUNA and you try to get legislative buy-in to a DUNA. It's probably no surprise that the Texas statutes regulating legal entities are very complicated. In my opinion, they're very good in a lot of ways. That they're very comparable to Delaware in a lot of ways, and they do things differently than Delaware does in a lot of ways that are good. But because of that, they become complicated, and there's a lot of pride of ownership in that, and we need to respect that. And I think that's going to be, going into the next legislative session, a key component is getting, I think, more industry help in educating legislatures and people who have the legislature's ear on not only the fact that DAOs are not designed to steal money from orphans and widows, but to explain what UNAs are being used for. I think there's a fundamental, the use of the term nonprofit is a lot more broad than people think it is, and also does not mean nobody makes any money.
Right.
The UNA can still produce money. The question is whether it's being, if you're getting a distribution like you would in Apple. Like I have Apple stock, I get a distribution, that's fine because it's Apple. But in UNAs, that's not what's happening. But the UNA can still make money.
You can't buy an UNA. There's no equity to be made in an UNA.
Right. And so I think that conversation, if I'm trying to educate legislatures, that's the conversation that we have. And then also bringing the use cases, bringing the city DAOs. ATX DAO, I sat in on a panel with them at Consensus, what they're doing, and the way that they're approaching it is like, look, we want to gap fill for social services that aren't being provided by the city, and we want to work with the city to do that. We're not trying to take control. We're not trying to usurp. We just want to like gap fill and help where there are gaps. There are other examples of this in all kinds of facets of that sort of in that vein. Foster care, education is a big one, and also other like use cases for blockchain in general that could have a DAO as governance. I was talking to a guy a couple of weeks ago which was solving a really dumb, interesting problem, which was I use the blockchain to track the movement of hazardous materials, which is like a great dumb problem to solve. Like I have hazardous chemicals, I need to label them and ship them in a very specific way, and I'm gonna use the blockchain to do that, to validate it across the entire supply chain for that. Like what a dumb, great problem. And if he had a DAO, you could probably argue it was an UNA if you structured it accordingly. So I think it's about decoupling what DAOs are made for, which is the governance piece of it, from the underlying businesses that are on the blockchain, and how do we explain that to people who don't have a lot of facility with the language and the terminology. We know this. We as an industry know that. I think it was at the first TBC summit in Austin. I can't remember who it was, but it was somebody that said like the blockchain industry has a communication problem, and I think we've not quite gotten there yet. We've gotten a lot better, but I think that remains the case, and this is a perfect example of that. And it's a great opportunity for us to be able to educate legislators in a non-confrontational, like we're not trying to save the world. We're just like this one specific thing that I think can really make us competitive across the country, but also, get a lot of clarity and help a lot of entities that are trying to navigate right now in the world in which they feel that they're not completely served.
Well, this kind of gets into, I think, what will interest the audience around DAOs is you do a lot of work both in litigation, but also you and your colleague, Alex Moore, you get a lot of inquiries from people in the digital asset space just because of y'all's expertise. What's like the most exciting, interesting projects that you have observed, both DAOs and otherwise?
Yeah. I really like the hazmat logistics guy, I'm not gonna lie. I like a dumb problem, because I think ultimately the reason I got excited about blockchain was much less about Dogecoin and Shiba Inu.
Kind of like boring problems.
Yeah, I think that the technology itself is fascinating, and what can we use that technology for? So get away from the exchanges and the trading and all of that, which for some people is great. Alex loves technical analysis, and I will never understand that reading of the tea leaves, and that's great for him. But like for me, I'm much more interested in what can we do with this foundational technology to advance technology on all fronts. And another, thought conversation that I had while we were at Consensus was, everybody's talking about AI. And frankly, AI being, I think, more scary for the average individual than blockchain, because it's much more pervasive in daily life. Every third email I get is about one of my systems turning on their AI capabilities. Instagram now is pushing AI labels at me. Yeah. And so I think, there's a lot of conversation around how do we validate how do we know we're not in a simulation, right? Yeah. It's sort of that problem. And frankly, blockchain is the absolute perfect foil for this. It's designed for validation. And so I actually am really interested in, I'm not seeing a lot of projects that are doing this yet, but I think it's coming, is an AI, whatever that is, coupled with an underlying blockchain foundation to validate your AI, basically, to be a fact checker.
So it almost reminds me, we talked at the legislature during Consensus, we went and briefed them on the intersection of blockchain and AI, and one of those, the commentary was around deep fakes and the idea that AI is digital abundance and blockchain is digital scarcity, and you almost need digital scarcity to defend against digital abundance, because until we get to a place in society where we suspect or have suspicion of every image that we see and every tech, which is a sad place to have to be, but we're going to have to get there.
Yeah.
Once we're there, I wonder if there's a place for a DAO of journalists across, both mainstream and traditional journalists, which people love to hate on right now, which is fine because they have messed up a lot of stuff in the last 30, 40 years. And also sort of the independent journalists that are becoming really common, to work together to establish, a DAO and a governance structure for like using blockchain and using hashes and timestamps and attestations for NFTs. images. Yeah, NFTs for images, for like the original speech text of a speech that hasn't been altered, and that's not super sexy. It's not like, but like it would be quite helpful. Yeah.
That's, I think, when I talk to, particularly when you talk to lawyers about AI, the two things you hear is it's gonna kill the billable hour, which is not true. And the second thing you hear is like, what about like authentication of evidence, right? This is something that's salient to what I do. Now, I think that the law, frankly, AI, the kind of nice thing I'll say about moving, having an AI practice and a blockchain practice, because we're sort of out in no man's land on blockchain, it is kind of nice that AI at least maps to a lot of standard structures. But we have rules in place that can do the authentication problem. But wouldn't it be great if there was, it became standard to say, like, Your Honor, I have, this photograph, and here's the here's the blockchain, here's the NFT that certifies that it's legitimate, that certifies it's the original, that certifies it's a copy of the original. Like, those are the sorts of use cases that I like. That's a kind of blockchain technology, and the use of it, frankly, it can make blockchain the hero of this narrative, right? And that is not a conversation that I think has been happening a lot, is what can we do with blockchain other than, 8,000% APY yield farms. And that is the thing that interests me always, is what are those use cases? And again, the social things, right? The gap filling for city services. We met with some guys at the Fort Worth DAO who came to a talk that Alex and I did on DAOs a few months ago, and they are doing like Web3 education for this next generation who are essentially digital native already, and educating them on this space in order to make them, give them useful skills. And what does that look like? And like, that's a good thing. I met a guy, this is more in the AI space, that there's a lot of education technology that I think blockchain can do, AI can do. So those are the sorts of use cases that I'm starting to hear about more, the like, let's build cool things on the blockchain. And that's the stuff that gets me excited and gets me interested. And that's the kind of stuff that I think a nonprofit UNA for a DAO is perfectly suited to be the governance structure for. Again, the people at the governance angle maybe aren't necessarily getting, the rewards from that, but there's going to have to be some governance for that platform, for that protocol, and how do we do that? And a DAO is obvious, and if you want to have a DAO and you don't want to send your members naked into the world, then you've got to have some kind of wrapper, and I think the Duna is the way to do that.
Yeah, and like we talked about, you can make money. There's not nonprofits that make money. They just can't do distributions. And
that, I think, is when you talk about UNAs, that I think is fundamentally, everybody just hears nonprofit and they don't actually know what that means.
Right.
And that, I think, and again, I think there's some conversation that needs to happen around that, is what those traditionally this is what happens, and there's nothing scary about that.
Yeah, you can't drive human action without incentives.
Yeah, and we, the Duna, the model Duna that Wyoming has at this moment is actually explicit about this, which the UNA is not, which is, look, you can't make distributions to your members. It is explicit about that. And so I think that's just the education piece of this. It never really occurred to me that, I don't know why we should never ascribe omniscience to our legislators, particularly in Texas, given that it's it is an 1 year on, 1 year off system. But listening now to what I'm hearing, we really have to go back to like very, very square one, have that conversation, and then we can explain like why we need the additional sort of gloss. I think that's kind of where I'm seeing how the gearing up into the session should look, among all the other sort of political machinations, which I don't pretend to know how that works, because that's not my job, thankfully.
It can get a little ugly at times.
Yeah.
Well, Monica, thanks for coming on the show. Where can people go to find out more about your work? Where do you publish papers, your litigation, past litigation, where's all that? Yeah, so
Carrington Coleman is my law firm. I'm very grateful to be a partner with them. We have a website, ccsb.com. As Lee said, my partner Alex Moore and I, we are the co-chairs of our blockchain digital assets industry group. We also just opened our AI advisory, and so our website's the best place to find us. I'm also on LinkedIn, as is Alex, and we are so happy to be members of the TBC, and thank you so much for having me, and looking forward to working with you going into next legislative session on this.
Likewise.
Awesome.
Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.